Let's bring you some more breaking news now. And parents who have been bereaved or children who've lost their parents through the infected blood scandal will now receive an interim payment to recognise their loss. It follows the conclusion of the second inquiry into thousands of patients who were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products in the 1970s and the 1980s. Well, let's get the latest now from Ashna Hurynag, who's been hearing more about the conclusions of this report. Tell us what they've had to say, Ashna.
This has long been described as the worst NHS treatment disaster in the NHS's history. Tens of thousands of NHS patients were infected with contaminated blood products from the 1970s to as soon as 1991, culminating in around 2,400 people losing their lives. Today, we have heard through the reading of this second interim report that's been released following this public inquiry that the bereaved parents and children of those victims will now receive an interim payment. That is a payment that, if it has not been already given to the partner of those who have been bereaved, it is now going to be given to immediate and wider family members, including, as I say, the parents who have lost a loved one or the victims' children. Here is the chair of this inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, giving his reaction.
My conclusion is that wrongs were done at individual, collective, and systemic levels. I will set out the detail of what happened and why in my full report. But my judgment is that not only do the infections themselves and their consequences merit compensation, but so, too, do the wrongs done by authority, whose response served to compound people's suffering.
There are three key things that have been outlined in this report, which the media have just been given in the last couple of hours to read over and has just been released. The first being that hepatitis B should also be recognised. The second being that psychological support should be offered here in England, and as it is across the other parts of the other nations across the UK, psychological support should be given to those who have been bereaved. And thirdly, the fact that these interim payments should now be extended to include other family members, totalling some £100,000 per victim. Someone who will now stand to gain this payment is Jason Evans, who is the founder and campaigner as part of this Factor 8 group. Jason, your father passed in 1993. You will now benefit from this payment. Your reaction, if you will, please.
Well, I think today is obviously a huge step forward. And whilst I think, everyone will broadly welcome the recommendations from the inquiry, what we need now is for the government to actually action that recommendation. As nice as it is that it's being recommended that there should be these payments of £100,000 where people have died and their death hasn't already been recognised, we actually need the government now to accept that recommendation and implement it. Otherwise, it's just a nice idea. So we've still got some way to go, but it's a huge step.
And this is just, as I say, an interim payment. There is due to be a wider compensation scheme that should always expect to come once the findings of this report in total in this inquiry is published later in the year. What difference will it mean to you having things like psychological support now when all of this happened to you about 30 years ago?
I was 4 years old when my dad died, and I know many of the people whose parents died when they were as young as me, younger than me, or even 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. I think it would have been helpful then. I think because of the amount of time that has passed, the damage has been done. I think it is important that people infected and affected have access to proper psychological support now, because they do still need it, but so much damage has already been done without it. I think that's part of the reason why you're seeing these recommendations for compensation. And what's really important from today is not just these interim payments, but also the confirmation that it's being recommended this compensation scheme should encompass parents and children and carers who, to be honest, have been left in limbo for the last couple of years, with the government saying, well, we don't know who might be included in compensation, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago when we met with the Cabinet Office Minister, Jeremy Quinn, that uncertainty was still there. It's a little less uncertain now, but we really need the Cabinet Office to move it forward.
Thank you very much, Jason. And that is the plan now. All of these recommendations will be presented to the government. The Paymaster General will review them and then hopefully, in the eyes of these campaigners, make those payments.
Ashna, thanks very much indeed for that. Well, let's get more reaction to Sir Brian Langstaff's latest report. I'm joined now by Richard Warwick, who's one of the victims of the infected blood scandal. Very good morning to you. Thanks so much for talking to us. I wondered, first of all, if you could give us your reaction to this key recommendation from Sir Brian to extend the compensation payments to families bereaved by the scandal, to children who've been orphaned and parents who've lost a child. Do you welcome that?
I'm extremely pleased, very pleased. I haven't had a great deal of time to look through the full report, but it's very refreshing to see some of the recommendations, especially for, in my case, for spouses, children, bereaved parents and family members. That's a really big step forward. I really appreciate that.
Well, yes, and you gave evidence yourself to the inquiry, didn't you, at an earlier stage. So tell us a little bit about what you told them and what happened to you.
Well, I was infected as a child with hepatitis B, C and HIV, and I've lived with those infections since that time. And it's had a devastating impact on my life and that of my family. And we're just so lucky. I'm so lucky I'm still here. Yeah, it's been horrendous. This last 30, 40 years of campaigning, it's been really tough, and it's finally we're getting somewhere. It looks as though there's light at the end of the tunnel. So yeah, very, very happy with this interim report.
Well, yes, and the other recommendation that's come out is for special psychological support to be extended to people in England as well. How helpful would that have been to you to have that kind of extra help along the way while you were battling what you were battling? Yes,
I couldn't agree more. It would have been extremely helpful and useful back in the day when we were properly suffering with the effects of HIV when treatment wasn't available. So I really do welcome that. I think it will go a long way to helping people deal with these infections in the future.
Well, yes, and also the other recommendation that Sir Brian Langstaff has made today is to extend the considerations to people who suffer with hepatitis B as well as hepatitis C. You had both, as I understand it. Do you welcome that recommendation?
Yeah, absolutely. I did read that at the beginning of the report, actually, and I won't say I was surprised, but I'm very grateful for that to be included because there was some ambiguity as to whether hepatitis B would be recognised. I think it only applies to people that have had the condition or suffered from the effects of the condition for over 6 months, but again, greatly welcome.
And I noticed that Sir Brian Langstaff has also said in his conclusion that wrong was done at individual, collective and systemic levels. Would you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. Fantastic statement, and I couldn't agree more with him. It's exactly what happened.
So you, as I say, gave evidence to the inquiry, and you are now welcoming Sir Brian Langstaff's conclusions in this interim report. Do you feel then that you have been heard and that others like you have been heard?
It's vindication for the time that we spent campaigning, putting our heads against the wall and being dismissed at every turn. It's like you're trying to, over these past 2 decades, for myself, it's been like trying to run towards a finish line, and that finish line has been getting further and further away, the nearer you approach it. We've been knocked back on so many occasions. I mean, it started with the Archer inquiry, then of course Penrose inquiry, which was a whitewash. So it looks as though we're going to get there. My only concern is the length of time it's going to take for government to implement these recommendations, these 17 recommendations in this second interim report. It's all about timing now, and urgency is the number one thing. We can't wait any longer. 500 people have died just during the inquiry to date, and many, many more are going to die in the future.
Well, Richard Warwick, we really appreciate your time and giving us your reaction to this latest interim report. We do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.